The first clue came like an unwelcome whisper, faint at first, almost imperceptible. I was sitting at my desk one ordinary evening, the soft hum of the streetlights outside the window blending with the gentle tick-tock of the clock. I didn't expect anything unusual. Just another evening in the dull routine of my life. Or so I thought. My wife, Claire, was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The familiar sound of her presence should have been comforting, but there was something off. Something I couldn't place, but it lingered, unsettling my thoughts. I glanced at my phone, half absent-mindedly scrolling through messages. Then a notification popped up. It was from an email address I didn't recognize. Normally, I wouldn't have paid any attention, but the subject line made my heart stutter. For your eyes only, this might change everything. The moment I opened it, I felt my pulse quicken. The email contained an attached file, a blurry photograph of Claire and my boss, James, in what seemed to be an intimate setting. It wasn't just a friendly meeting, not even a casual handshake or work-related encounter. The way they were standing close to each other, their hands almost touching, their heads bent in deep conversation. It was the kind of closeness that made my stomach twist with something I couldn't name. The room around me suddenly felt smaller, air thicker, suffocating. The clock on the wall ticked louder, each second dragging painfully longer than the one before. I closed the phone, unable to breathe for a moment, my thoughts spinning. Is this real? Did I imagine it? I couldn't process what I was seeing, couldn't understand why this email had come to me. I had no evidence, no real confirmation. But a feeling crawled up my spine, one I'd ignored for years. Claire had changed recently. Little things, her late nights at work, the sudden need to meet friends, the way her eyes would shift when I asked about the details of her day. And James, he'd been more than just my boss. He was the kind of man who moved in rooms like he owned them, tall with the kind of sharp, cold gaze that could cut through anyone's defense. His tailored suits fit him perfectly, and he carried himself with a kind of confidence that always made him stand out. But I trusted Claire. I thought we were solid. We had built something over 5 years, a home, laughter, shared moments. And yet, this moment made everything feel like it was built on sand. I couldn't bring myself to tell Claire right away. The anger and hurt swirling inside me were too much. I needed time to think, to piece together what I had seen and what it meant. But the longer I waited, the more I found myself obsessing over the details. The way her smile had seemed more distant lately, the way her gaze had faltered when I asked her about her day. The weight of my suspicion was suffocating. The next morning, as I watched her move around the house, I couldn't stop my thoughts from racing. Was I overthinking this? Could the photo be fabricated? Maybe I'm just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew there was something there. Something I couldn't ignore. I started to retrace my steps, asking myself when everything had begun to unravel. Was it in the subtle moments I dismissed? The odd tension that had built between us, without me acknowledging it? My mind raced through memories, each one now tinged with doubt. It wasn't long before I had more pieces to the puzzle. Claire's phone was unlocked one afternoon while she was in the shower, her phone buzzing incessantly on the countertop. I could feel my pulse race, my hands trembling as I picked it up. There, sitting innocently, were dozens of texts between her and James. Texts filled with emojis, affectionate words, and references to late-night meetings. Why hadn't I noticed before? My heart sank as I realized just how much I had been blind to. I felt a quiet rage simmer inside me. Not at James, not yet, but at myself, for not seeing the truth sooner, for trusting without questioning. The discovery didn't come in one bold, devastating moment. No. It was in the slow, excruciating realization that everything I thought I knew was a lie. I had no answers, only more questions. And I wasn't sure I was ready to face them. But deep down, I knew that the path ahead, however painful, was now inevitable. The truth would have to come out, and when it did, everything would change. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling of my life. I couldn't escape the gnawing suspicion that had burrowed deep within me. Every glance I exchanged with Claire, every word that passed between us, felt hollow, like we were both playing parts in a script neither of us had written. I tried to maintain the facade of normalcy. Claire was her usual self, distracted but kind, asking about my day with a tenderness that almost made me sick. But I couldn't hear her, not really. My mind was filled with the image of her and James together, the way they had looked in that photograph, close in a way that suggested intimacy beyond mere friendship or professional ties. I had to know the truth. One evening, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at Claire as she sliced vegetables for dinner. Her movements were so familiar, so practiced, yet I couldn't shake the sense of distance. It was as if she was already a stranger, and I was just waiting for the final confirmation to make it all real. She glanced up at me then, her eyes meeting mine. There was a fleeting moment where I thought I saw a hint of hesitation in her gaze, a tiny flicker of something, guilt, perhaps. But it was gone before I could grasp it. She smiled softly, the same smile that had once made me feel so secure, so loved. Was it real? Was any of it real? "How was work today?" she asked, her voice light, almost too light. I hesitated. The urge to confront her, to demand answers, was overwhelming. But instead, I asked a question that felt like it had been festering inside me for days, something I hadn't dared to utter aloud. "How long have you and James been close?" Her knife stopped mid-air, and the sudden stillness between us was suffocating. Claire's eyes flickered for just a fraction of a second, and then she carefully set the knife down, wiping her hands on a dish towel. The calmness in her demeanor only deepened my suspicion. She wasn't surprised. She knew this moment was coming. "What do you mean?" Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, a tone that didn't quite match her words. "Don't play dumb, Claire," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I could feel the tension rising between us, thick and heavy. "I know about the texts, the late-night meetings. I saw the picture." Her face paled for a moment, but she quickly masked it with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but the edge in her voice was sharper now. "You're overreacting." Overreacting? I couldn't suppress the laugh that escaped me, bitter and hollow. "Am I? You don't get to lie to me like this, Claire." I saw her flinch just for a second, but it was enough. It was like a crack in the dam, a brief moment where the facade faltered. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, I saw vulnerability in her, and it terrified me. "Why, Claire?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "Why him? Why James?" She didn't answer at first. She stood there, her eyes searching mine like she was trying to find a way to explain something that could never be explained. Then, finally, her shoulders slumped, as if she had been holding herself together for too long. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said, her voice barely audible. "I never planned it. It just did." My heart pounded in my chest, the pain so raw, so jagged that it almost felt physical. It just did. The words felt like a betrayal of everything we had built. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break something. But instead, I stood there in the silence that stretched between us, the air thick with unspoken words. The truth was in front of me now, undeniable, yet I couldn't quite process it. I could feel the ground beneath me shifting, the life I knew disintegrating into something unrecognizable. Claire finally met my eyes, her face a mask of regret, but there was something else there, too. Defensiveness. A quiet resignation. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I never wanted this to happen. But James, he understood me. In ways you didn't. in ways I needed. I didn't know how to fix it, and I didn't know how to stop it. Her words hung in the air like a cold, bitter wind. I felt my hands trembling, my body tense with the urge to lash out, to scream at her, at myself, at the world. How long? I wanted to ask. How long had this been going on? But I didn't. Instead, I turned away, my breath shallow. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I don't even know who you are anymore. There was a long pause, and then I heard her move toward me. I could feel her presence behind me, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I'm sorry, she whispered, so softly it barely reached my ears. I really am. But those words, like everything else, felt empty. They couldn't undo the damage, couldn't heal the wound she had carved into my heart. The days after that conversation felt like I was walking through a fog, each step heavy, each breath shallow. I moved through the house like a ghost, a stranger in my own life. Claire was still here, still moving around the house with the same grace, the same calm demeanor she always had. But I couldn't see her anymore. Not really. She was just a figure in the background, a reminder of the betrayal that now defined everything between us. We didn't speak much after that night. The silence between us was deafening. It was as if we were both waiting for something, waiting for the words that would break the dam, the conversation that would finally shatter the fragile wall of avoidance we had built around our lives. But I couldn't bring myself to say more. I didn't know how. There was too much pain, too much uncertainty in my heart. I could feel the weight of the unanswered questions pressing against my chest every time I looked at her. I avoided James as much as I could. Work was a blur. I didn't want to see him, didn't want to hear his voice. But then one afternoon, as if fate were mocking me, I found myself standing face to face with him in the elevator at the office. He was smiling, looking as polished and confident as ever, his eyes sharp and calculating. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, the urge to confront him, to demand answers. But all I could do was stare at him, my jaw clenched, my heart racing. "Hey, man," James said, his voice casual, like nothing had changed, like nothing had happened. "How's it going? Haven't seen you in a while." I wanted to say something, anything to expose him, to make him feel the weight of what he had done. But instead, I just nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "It's fine," I said, my voice cold and clipped. "Just busy, you know." The elevator doors opened, and we both stepped out, the tension between us almost palpable. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. His stride was confident, purposeful. It made my fists clench. He had taken something from me, something that I couldn't get back, and yet he seemed completely unaffected. The rage inside me simmered, but I held it in. I had to. I wasn't sure if I could confront James directly, not yet. I still needed answers. I still needed to understand why. Why Claire had done this. Why James had allowed it to happen. That evening, after dinner, Claire's attempt at normalcy, which only made the weight of the evening feel heavier, I finally found myself sitting across from her at the kitchen table. She looked at me, her face softened with concern, but I couldn't meet her eyes. Not after what I knew, not after everything she had said to me. "Are we going to talk about this?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling just slightly. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stared at my hands, trying to summon the strength to face her, to look her in the eye and ask the questions that had been swirling in my mind for days. Why did you do this? What were you looking for? Instead, what came out was different. Was it worth it? My voice cracked with the question, and I immediately regretted it. The hurt in those words was raw, exposed. I hadn't intended to sound so broken, but I couldn't hide it. Claire's eyes softened, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something. but the words never came. She was silent for a long moment, and I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background, the ticking of the clock on the wall. "I don't know," she finally whispered, her voice small. "I don't know what I was looking for. I thought I thought I could find something for myself. I never meant to hurt you." Her eyes were wet now, her face a mask of regret, but the words felt like nothing more than an echo of what she had already said. There was something cold about her apology now, something that didn't feel genuine, not anymore. I felt my chest tighten, the walls closing in. What had I done to deserve this? What had I missed all these years? I looked at her, the woman I had once loved, and realized that the love I thought we shared was now a distant memory. It had been replaced by something broken, something irrevocable. "Do you love him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The question had been sitting there, unspoken, but I needed to know. I needed to hear her say it, needed to see if there was any truth left in her words. She hesitated, the silence between us stretching painfully thin. Finally, she nodded. "I do," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I do love him. In a way that I don't know how to explain. I don't know how it happened or why, but it did, and I hate myself for it." Those words hit me like a slap. She loved him. She loved him more than me, and I could do nothing but sit there, feeling the betrayal wrap itself tighter around my chest until I could barely breathe. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The truth hung in the air like a weight we couldn't lift, both of us too exhausted, too broken to say anything else. I didn't know what to do, what to say to make it stop, to make the pain go away. All I knew was that, in that moment, I was standing at the edge of something I didn't recognize, something fractured and torn, and I didn't know how to put it back together. The days that followed were a blur of empty conversations and hollow silences. Claire and I were like two strangers sharing a house, our interactions mechanical, devoid of the warmth that had once defined us. I would watch her sometimes, going through the motions of her daily routines, her presence both comforting and suffocating at once. There were moments when I thought I saw a flicker of the woman I had married, but they were fleeting, like smoke slipping through my fingers. Her words about loving James echoed in my mind, twisting the knife deeper. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung, but the fact that she had chosen him over everything we had built, everything I had trusted her with. It was the why that gnawed at me, the unanswered question that refused to let me sleep, to let me think clearly. What had James given her that I hadn't? What had I failed to provide? I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. Every glance, every touch felt contaminated, as if the foundation of everything had been tainted by secrets and lies. And yet, despite the gaping wound in my chest, I stayed. Maybe out of habit, maybe out of some misplaced sense of loyalty, I didn't know. But I couldn't leave her yet, not until I had answers. It wasn't until a week later that I finally saw James again, this time in a situation I hadn't expected. It was late afternoon, and I had decided to go to a coffee shop nearby, hoping to clear my head, to think. I had been avoiding the office as much as I could, burying myself in tasks at home, but today I couldn't escape it. I needed air. I needed to be out of the house for a while, to find something, anything, to distract myself. And there he was. James sat at a table by the window, his back to me, but there was no mistaking him. I recognized the way he sat, the casual confidence with which he leaned back in his chair, a cup of coffee in front of him. It was the same posture I had seen countless times at the office, relaxed, yet in control. He was oblivious to my presence, but I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. This was the man who had broken everything I had thought I knew. My heart was pounding, the anger that had simmered for days now rising to the surface, threatening to spill over. I couldn't leave now, not without confronting him, not without demanding answers. I walked toward the counter, ordering a coffee, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my nerves. As I waited for my drink, I kept my eyes on James, unable to tear my gaze away. The air between us felt charged, thick with the history of what he had done. When the barista called my name, I hesitated for a moment, then took my drink and walked straight toward his table. My footsteps felt like they were echoing in my head, the sound growing louder with each step until it was the only thing I could hear. "James," I said, my voice low but steady. The words seemed to crack the bubble of his calm, and he turned toward me, his face lighting up with that practiced, smooth smile. "Hey, man. Didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice warm, as if nothing had changed between us, as if I weren't about to tear down everything we had built. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I set my coffee down on the table with a little more force than necessary, the cup rattling against the saucer. The sound seemed to catch his attention, and his smile faltered just slightly. I leaned in, my eyes narrowing, my words deliberate. "Why her?" I asked, my voice raw. "Why Claire?" His smile slipped away, replaced by an unreadable expression. For a moment he said nothing, and I hated him for it, hated that he could sit there so composed while I was falling apart. "That's a bit of a loaded question, don't you think?" he finally said, his tone casual but with a hint of something I couldn't quite place. "It's not like I planned it, you know. It just happened." I felt a jolt of frustration, my hands clenching into fists. Just happened, the same words Claire had used. But this wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't something that just happened. "You can't just say that," I said, my voice rising without meaning to. "You knew she was married, you knew she was mine, and yet you went after her anyway." James didn't flinch, didn't even look uncomfortable. Instead, he met my gaze with a kind of cold amusement, his lips curling slightly. "You think I went after her?" he asked, his voice almost mocking. "No, man. She came to me. She's not some innocent victim in all this." His words hit me like a slap, the final blow I hadn't been prepared for. He was right, I realized, and the realization made my blood run cold. Claire had chosen this. She had walked down that path willingly, and that hurt more than anything he could say. "But you let it happen," I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "You didn't stop her. You didn't stop it from going too far." James shrugged, his demeanor nonchalant, like he was discussing the weather rather than a shattered relationship. "What do you want me to say, man? It's not like I'm the first guy to fall for a married woman. It's just complicated." "Complicated," I repeated, the word tasting like poison. "That's it? That's all you've got to say for yourself?" He stared at me for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, a slow smile creeping across his face. "What do you expect me to say? That I'm sorry? That it was a mistake? We both know it wasn't." Claire knew exactly what she was doing. The finality in his words hit me like a wave crashing against the shore. There was no remorse in his voice, no regret, and for the first time I realized that James wasn't the one who had broken me. He had just been the catalyst. It was Claire who had chosen this path. It was her choice, her actions that had led us here. I stood there for a moment, struggling to steady my breath. The anger inside me was still there, burning, but it was starting to shift, turning into something darker, something colder. I would never let this go. I would carry this with me, and it would shape everything that came after. Finally, I turned away, unable to look at him for another second. I walked out of the coffee shop without another word, the door's bell ringing softly behind me. My heart was pounding, but there was a strange sense of clarity settling in. The truth was out there, and now I had to decide what to do with it. The cold air outside hit me like a shock to the system, the sharpness of it seeping into my bones. I walked aimlessly, the weight of the conversation with James still heavy in my chest, a constant throb. I had known, in the deepest part of me, that Claire had chosen this path, that she had willingly walked into James's arms. But hearing it from his lips, seeing the casual indifference on his face, made it feel even worse. It was as if he was claiming some twisted victory, as if he were proud of what had unfolded. I needed time. Time to think, to let the storm inside me settle. So I wandered, my feet carrying me without purpose, through streets I knew well, but felt distant in that moment, like they belonged to a life that wasn't mine anymore. I don't know how long I walked. Maybe an hour, maybe two. My mind kept replaying the conversation with James, his words echoing in my head. Claire knew exactly what she was doing. I kept thinking about that, running it through my mind like a mantra, and with each repetition, I felt a little more of my trust in her slip away. The woman I had built my life with, the woman I had loved and protected, was she ever really mine? Or had I just been a place to rest while she explored other options? What do I do now? That question haunted me. The easy answer was to leave, to walk away, to cut my losses and never look back. But the reality of it wasn't so simple. How could I leave when we had so much history together? The years, the memories, the promises made in the quiet of the night. Could I really just throw all of that away? I found myself standing in front of the building we had once bought together, the place where we had planned our future, where we had envisioned a life built on love and mutual respect. But now it felt like a monument to everything that had gone wrong. The windows stared back at me blankly, like empty eyes, and for the first time I couldn't see the warmth in it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, the impulse to call her overwhelming. I wasn't sure what I would say. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I just needed to hear her voice, to gauge her sincerity, if there was any left. Before I could press her number, my mind flashed back to a memory, a moment, long ago, when we were sitting on the couch together, laughing over some stupid joke, our hands intertwined. It had been so simple then, so uncomplicated. Why couldn't it have stayed that way? I put the phone back into my pocket and turned away from the building, deciding to keep walking. My mind was a mess, spinning in circles. I couldn't confront her yet, not when I was still drowning in anger and hurt. She had crossed a line, yes, but so had I. Hadn't I? The thought came out of nowhere like a bolt of lightning striking me. Had I missed something? Had I ignored signs, things that should have made me question what was happening? I hadn't been blind, not really. I had sensed the distance between us growing over time, had noticed the subtle changes in her behavior, her late nights at work, the way she had started to seem distant, almost absent at times. But I had told myself that it was nothing, that it was just stress, or maybe just the natural ebb and flow of a long relationship. But now, with everything laid bare, I realized how foolish I had been. I had ignored my own instincts. I had buried my suspicions under the weight of comfort, of routine. I had chosen to believe in the idea of us rather than see the cracks in the foundation. I was angry at Claire, yes, but I was angry at myself, too, for not seeing what was right in front of me, for not acting sooner. The evening was creeping in, and I found myself at the park, sitting on one of the benches by the small lake that ran through the center of the city. The water was still, reflecting the darkening sky above. It was peaceful, in a way. A strange contrast to the storm raging in my mind. What now? I knew I couldn't keep going like this, living in this limbo, half in, half out. I needed to make a decision, to stop letting the uncertainty fester. But I was terrified of what that decision would mean. I glanced at my phone again, this time at the message Claire had sent me earlier in the day. "We need to talk." The message was simple. She wanted to talk, but I couldn't bring myself to answer it. I didn't know if I was ready for the conversation that would follow. I wasn't sure I ever would be. I sat there for a long time, watching the sky turn from dusk to night. My mind was a battleground, torn between anger, love, betrayal, and uncertainty. At some point, I realized that I couldn't keep running away from the inevitable. The confrontation with Claire was coming, and I would have to face her sooner or later. I couldn't keep pretending I didn't know the truth, or that it didn't matter. I stood up, wiping the dampness from my pants where I had been sitting too long, and walked back toward home. Every step felt like a weight I had to carry. I stood in front of the door for a moment, my hand poised over the doorknob, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. The house was quiet, too quiet. Even the muffled sound of Claire's voice on the phone seemed to hang in the air, a reminder that we were still living separate lives under the same roof. What will I say? The question lingered in my mind, but it didn't have an answer. Not yet. I could feel the familiar warmth of the house behind the door, but it felt foreign now, as though the place I once called home had become something else entirely. How could I walk back in and act like everything was okay? How could I pretend to be the person I was before I knew? Before this? I finally pushed open the door, the familiar creak echoing in the silence. My heart was pounding as I stepped inside. Claire was sitting on the couch, her back turned to me, her phone pressed against her ear. She didn't hear me at first. Her words were too low, too muffled. But I caught snippets, fragments of a conversation that sounded nothing like the woman I thought I knew. "I don't know, James," she said, her voice soft but with an edge I hadn't heard before. "He's still here. I'm not sure what to do next." There was a pause, and she let out a quiet sigh. "I can't keep living like this." James. The name hit me like a slap to the face, but I didn't say anything. I just stood there, frozen for a moment, the full weight of the reality crashing over me. She was talking to him. She was talking about us as if we were two strangers caught in a tangled mess. The life I thought we shared was no longer just mine. I took a slow, measured breath and walked into the room, making my presence known. The sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Claire turned, her eyes widening when she saw me standing there, the phone still pressed to her ear. She quickly pulled the phone away, her face flushing with a mixture of guilt and something else I couldn't place. Her lips parted like she was about to say something, but no words came. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, and I could feel the tension rising, pulling us further apart. I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear the truth right now or if I was too afraid to face it. But it didn't matter. I had already heard enough. I didn't sit down. I didn't move closer. I stood there, watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter now, almost apologetic. I didn't mean for this to happen, okay? I never planned this." I could hear the desperation in her voice, the need to explain, to justify what she had done. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear her version anymore. The truth was, her words felt hollow. What was the point of explaining when the betrayal was already so clear? "You never planned it?" I repeated, my voice low, almost to the point of disbelief. "But you chose it. You chose him, Claire. Over me. Over everything we had." Her gaze dropped, and she ran a hand through her hair, the gesture almost automatic, like she was trying to control the chaos swirling inside her. "I didn't know what else to do," she said, her voice breaking. "Things had been distant between us for so long. I felt so alone." The words hit me harder than I expected. I had seen the distance growing between us, felt it in every passing day, every conversation that lacked the spark we once had. But I had convinced myself it was just a phase, a rough patch. I hadn't realized how far gone we were until this moment, until Claire was telling me she had been so lost that she turned to someone else. I clenched my fists at my sides, fighting the wave of anger and sadness that rose inside me. She was lonely. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a reason. And I knew that despite everything, she wasn't a villain. She was just broken in a way that I hadn't seen. "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered, her voice trembling. I never wanted to hurt you. The vulnerability in her voice almost made me want to believe her, but I couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The trust was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces, and no amount of apology or explanation could piece it back together. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "How long, Claire?" The words came out before I could stop them. "How long had this been going on? How many nights did you spend with him while I was here waiting for you?" She flinched at the question, her eyes closing as if she couldn't bear to hear it. "It wasn't like that," she said quickly, but the tremble in her voice betrayed her. "It started small, just talking at first, but I couldn't stop it once it started. And I didn't know how to stop myself. I didn't know how to fix what was broken." My chest tightened at her words, a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak twisting in my gut. I couldn't stop myself from speaking again. "You should have come to me, Claire. You should have talked to me. Al should have talked to me. We could have worked through it. But instead, you shut me out. And you turned to him." She stood up suddenly, moving toward me, her hands outstretched in a gesture of plea. "I know," she said, tears starting to brim in her eyes. "I know I messed up, but I love you. I do love you, even if I made terrible choices." I shook my head, stepping back slightly. "You don't get it, Claire. Love isn't just words, it's trust. It's loyalty. And you broke both." Her face crumpled, and for a moment I saw the rawness of her regret, the pain of knowing that no matter what she said, it couldn't undo the damage. There was a long silence between us, each of us lost in our thoughts, struggling to find some thread of connection. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if we could ever find our way back to each other, or if the damage was simply too great. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something shift within me. A small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to heal. Or maybe, just maybe, it was time for us both to let go. But not tonight, not yet. The silence between us stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I could feel the tension in my chest, my heart working overtime to make sense of everything that had happened. Claire's eyes were brimming with tears, and she reached out again, but I stepped back. Just a small movement, but enough to create distance. "I don't know what to say, Claire," I said, the words coming out rough, as if they had been lodged in my throat for too long. "I don't know how we get past this." Her hands fell to her sides, her body shrinking, as if the realization of the damage had finally hit her. "I don't either," she whispered. "But I want to try, if you'll let me." The words hung in the air, floating between us like a fragile thread. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that beneath everything there was still something worth salvaging. But my mind kept pulling me back to the same place. The trust. The betrayal. How could I ever look at her the same way again? How could I move forward when I knew that the woman I had loved had turned to someone else for comfort, for something I couldn't give her? "I'm not sure I can forgive you," I said, the honesty in my voice almost startling me. "I don't know how to look at you and not see him. Every time I try, I keep hearing your voice, I keep imagining you with him, laughing, touching him like you used to touch me." I paused, my breath catching in my throat. "I don't know if I can do this anymore." Her face crumbled, and for a moment, I thought she might break down completely. But she held it together, as though trying to piece herself back up in front of me, trying to hold on to the remnants of what we once were. "I understand," she said softly, wiping her eyes. "I deserve that. I deserve for you to feel this way. I don't know how to fix it, but I want to try. I'll do anything." The desperation in her voice, the pleading look in her eyes, made something stir inside me. But it wasn't a feeling of love. It was a deep, hollow ache that I wasn't sure I could fill anymore. I shook my head. "I don't know how to fix it either, Claire. I don't even know where to start. We're not the same people we were before all this happened. I'm not the same person." The words came out colder than I intended, but it was the truth. Something in me had shifted. That deep, unwavering trust I had for her had been shattered beyond recognition, and now I couldn't find a way back to who we were. Not yet, anyway. She stepped closer, but this time I didn't step away. She was so close I could feel the heat from her skin, the warmth that had once been so familiar to me. The smell of her perfume, the scent of something soft and floral, filled my senses. It was the same, and yet it felt foreign. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Please don't make me lose you." I felt my chest tighten again, a battle raging within me. I wanted to reach out to her, to pull her close, to feel the weight of her against me like it used to be. I wanted to believe in her, to believe that we could fix this. But the wounds were still too fresh, the scars too visible. "I don't know what's left to save, Claire," I said quietly, almost to myself. "I really don't know." She let out a shaky breath, her face pale, and for the first time since this all began, I saw the full weight of her regret. It was real, raw, and unguarded. She wasn't just sorry for getting caught. She was sorry for the choices she had made, for the ways she had hurt me. But was it enough? Could it ever be enough? "I can't change the past," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't undo what I did, but I'll spend the rest of my life making it right. If you'll let me." I stared at her for a long moment, searching her face, looking for something, anything, that would make me believe her. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could fix this. But the truth was, I wasn't sure if I could ever trust her again. I wasn't sure if I could ever look at her without seeing the shadow of what had happened, without remembering the betrayal, without feeling the sting of her infidelity. The room felt suffocating now. Every word we said seemed to hang in the air, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. I needed space. I needed time to think. I needed something other than this. "I don't know if I can do this, Claire," I said again, my voice breaking. "I don't know if I can live like this, constantly questioning everything, wondering if you're lying again. I don't know if I can keep hurting like this." Her expression faltered, and she stepped back, as though my words had physically struck her. The hope that had been in her eyes a moment ago dimmed, and for the first time, I saw the full weight of her own fear. The fear of losing me, of losing everything. "I understand," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to do without you." I looked at her one last time, then turned away, my heart aching with a mixture of anger and sorrow. I couldn't fix this right now, and I didn't know if I ever could. I walked away, leaving her standing there, her tears falling in the silence. And as I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this might be the beginning of the end. I didn't know what the future held for us. But I knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. I walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. The weight of my own footsteps echoed in my mind, each one a reminder of the distance that had grown between us, between the man I was and the man I'd become since discovering the truth. My mind churned with a storm of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion, none of them making sense, none of them feeling like they could ever be resolved. The door behind me seemed to shut on its own, but I didn't look back. The house felt colder now, colder than I ever remembered it being. I went into the bedroom, locking the door behind me. The space that had once been ours felt hollow, almost as if it had turned into a foreign land. The bed, the familiar scent of her pillow, the slight indentation where her side of the bed had been, it all felt like a cruel mockery of the life we had once shared. I collapsed onto the bed, my fingers digging into the sheets as if I could somehow pull the memories back, undo the hurt, piece together the things that had been shattered. But nothing came. Nothing but emptiness. I didn't know how long I lay there, just staring at the ceiling, fighting the urge to scream. Time seemed to slow, every tick of the clock stretching out the tension in my chest, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this house, in this place where every corner held the echoes of her lies, of his name. I stood up abruptly, pacing the room, trying to make sense of what had happened. I love her, I told myself. I loved her once. But could I still love her? Could I still feel the warmth of her touch, the security of her presence after everything? Could I forget the image of her with him, her smile not for me, but for him? The thought of it made bile rise in my throat, and I turned away from the bed, unable to face it, unwilling to let the memories haunt me. The phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw Claire's name flashing on the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the answer button. The silence in the room seemed to grow louder the longer I waited. I wanted to pick up. I wanted to hear her voice again, to listen to her beg for forgiveness, to hear her tell me she was sorry in 1,000 different ways, in 1,000 different tones. But deep down, I knew that hearing her again would only make the pain worse. I didn't need her words anymore. I needed space. I needed time. I swiped the phone away, silencing it. It buzzed again almost immediately, a text message this time. "Please, we need to talk. I can't let you go like this." I wanted to text back. I wanted to tell her that maybe, in time, we could figure this out. But I also knew that wasn't the truth. The truth was, I didn't know if I could ever talk to her again without seeing the ghost of James standing between us, without hearing his voice in my head every time she opened her mouth. I tossed the phone onto the bed, the glow of the screen still illuminating the room. I could feel my heart rate quickening, my chest tightening with the pressure of everything I couldn't control. She wanted to talk. She wanted to fix things. But what could we fix? Could we fix a love that had been broken by betrayal, by lies? I ran my hands through my hair, pacing again. The ache in my chest was constant now, like a wound that refused to heal, like a part of me that had been ripped out and left to bleed. I kept asking myself the same question. What now? What was I supposed to do with this? With the mess we had created? I heard the faint sound of her footsteps outside the door, and I froze. Was she standing out there, listening? Did she know how badly I was falling apart? How much I needed to escape this house, this life? I moved to the door, slowly, my hand lingering on the knob, but I couldn't open it. Not yet. There was too much I still didn't know, too much pain that I hadn't let myself feel. I sank back onto the bed, my body feeling heavy with exhaustion, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind was too full of questions, too full of the images of what had happened. Claire's face, tear-streaked and pleading. Her words of regret. The moments when she had held my hand. Her smile still burned into my mind. But none of that mattered now. Not with the weight of the truth pressing down on me. I needed to leave. I needed to walk away, even if just for a moment. I grabbed my jacket from the chair by the door and slipped it on, the familiar weight of it a small comfort in this sea of chaos. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I left the room, the house silent now, the only sound the soft thud of my footsteps against the hardwood floor. Claire was nowhere to be found. She was probably waiting, sitting somewhere in the house, still hoping for something, anything, to fix this. I walked out the door, into the cold night air. The world outside felt different, too. The streets bathed in the pale light of the moon, the cool breeze biting at my skin. Everything felt detached. The world seemed to be moving on, but I was stuck here, in this space between love and pain, between memories and regrets. I didn't know how long I walked or where I went, but I couldn't stop. My thoughts were too loud, too consuming. I needed space. I needed time to clear my head, to process what had happened, to figure out what I could do next. I didn't know if there was a next. I didn't know if I could ever go back to Claire. But I knew one thing. I couldn't stay here, not while the wound was still so fresh. For now, the only thing I could do was keep walking, keep moving, keep running from the reality I didn't know how to face. The night air wrapped around me like a blanket, cold and sharp, but it wasn't enough to numb the storm brewing inside my chest. I walked without a destination, letting my feet carry me through the quiet streets, each step an attempt to outrun the suffocating weight of everything that had unraveled. I passed the familiar houses, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement, the world seemingly oblivious to the chaos that had taken root in my life. As I walked, my thoughts kept circling back to her, to Claire. The sound of her voice, the pleading tone, the desperation in her eyes. It all felt like a heavy weight on my shoulders, pulling me back toward the life I thought I knew. I could hear her words echoing in my mind. "I'll do anything to make it right." But what could she possibly do to fix this? How could we ever go back to the way things were when everything was tainted by lies, by her betrayal? My mind kept drifting to the moment I had uncovered the truth, to the way the world had shifted under my feet. I could still feel the sickening twist in my stomach when I first found the evidence. Texts, emails, little reminders of the life she'd been living while I was oblivious, wrapped up in my own routine. I could still feel the burning humiliation, the disbelief that someone I had trusted, someone I had loved, had lied to me so easily, so convincingly. I hadn't seen the signs. Maybe I'd been too wrapped up in my own world, too busy, too trusting, to see what was right in front of me. Or maybe I had refused to see. I'd trusted Claire so completely, and now I wasn't sure who she really was anymore. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I loved, had been living a life with him, a life that didn't include me. I stopped walking for a moment, standing at the edge of a small park, the night still and quiet, the trees around me whispering softly in the wind. I sat down on a bench, running my hands through my hair in frustration. The silence of the world around me seemed to mock my inner chaos. What was I supposed to do now? I couldn't just pretend everything was fine, that this didn't matter. I couldn't ignore the deep ache in my chest every time I thought of her, of them. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the memory of what she said. "I want to try, if you'll let me." She was asking for a chance. But how could I give her one? How could I let myself trust her again after everything? I stared at my phone, its glow casting an eerie light in the darkness. Claire's name flashed on the screen again, a message waiting. The impulse to look at it was strong, but I resisted. I didn't want to hear her voice right now. I didn't want to hear her apologies, her promises. I needed space. I needed time. I stood up from the bench and began walking again, the motion helping to clear my mind, or at least numb the chaos swirling within it. Each step felt like a small victory, each one a step further away from the pain, from the memories that felt like they were suffocating me. But I knew that I couldn't escape this. No matter how far I walked, no matter how much distance I put between us, the truth was always going to be there. I could walk away from her, but I couldn't walk away from the feelings, from the betrayal, from the heartbreak. I didn't know how to fix any of this. The road ahead felt uncertain, like walking into a fog with no sense of direction. I wanted to believe that things could get better, that in time I could forgive her, that we could rebuild what had been broken. But deep down, I didn't know if I could. I kept walking, the city lights blurring in the distance, the cold night air biting at my skin. After what felt like hours, I found myself standing in front of a bar I used to visit sometimes. The neon sign flickered in the darkness, a beacon calling to me. I didn't know why I came here. Maybe it was the loneliness, the need for some distraction. Maybe I just needed to be surrounded by something familiar, something that wasn't her, something that didn't carry the weight of everything that had changed. I walked inside, the warmth of the bar wrapping around me like a comforting embrace, the low murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, the hum of a familiar tune playing in the background. It was all so ordinary, so easy. The bartender gave me a quick nod, and I slid onto a stool, grateful for the moment of normalcy. I ordered a drink, something strong, something that could dull the edge of the pain that had settled deep in my bones. The cool liquid slid down my throat, the bitterness hitting my tongue. I leaned back against the bar, staring into my drink, my mind still swirling with thoughts of Claire, of everything we had been, everything we were supposed to be. Could I forgive her? Could I ever get past this? I didn't have the answers. I didn't know what the future held, but for now, all I could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time, and pray that someday, somehow, the pieces. I didn't have the answers. I didn't know what the future held, but for now, all I could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time, and pray that someday, somehow, the pieces of me that were left would find a way to heal. I sat there at the bar, the amber liquid in front of me growing warm with each passing minute. The noise of the bar, the clinking glasses and low chatter, felt distant, like I was observing it all from another world. My eyes, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened, stayed focused on the swirling liquid in my glass. Maybe this is how it starts. Maybe this is where it all ends. The thought came unbidden, and I almost wanted to laugh. And it was far from over, wasn't it? It was only just beginning. I didn't even know what over meant anymore. I took another sip, the burn of alcohol sinking into my chest, but it didn't numb the ache. The bitterness of the drink couldn't drown out the bitter thoughts that kept creeping back in. She didn't mean it. That voice, soft but persistent, was a whisper in my mind. The voice that tried to defend her. It was the voice that had tried to convince me that maybe she didn't betray me the way it seemed. Maybe it was just a mistake, a misstep. Maybe it was only a fleeting weakness. But then the pictures, the messages, the evidence. I shut my eyes, forcing the thoughts away. The bartender approached again, refilling my glass without a word. I nodded my thanks, though I didn't know why. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to be anywhere. I couldn't stay in my mind, though. I needed to get out. So I stood up and left some cash on the bar, more than enough to cover the drinks, even if I didn't care about the cost. I walked out into the cold night air again, the weight of everything still pulling at me. The streets felt quieter now, the city's hum fading as the night deepened. I had no idea where I was going, just like I had no idea what I was doing. Every street corner seemed to blur, like I was walking in circles inside my own head. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, the chill biting at my skin, but it didn't help. I stopped at a streetlight, standing there for a moment, watching the cars pass by, feeling as if I were suspended in time. How much longer could I keep running from the truth? I didn't have the answers, but I couldn't keep going like this, couldn't keep pretending that walking away from her would fix anything. But what would fixing it look like? What would we look like if there was anything left to salvage? Could I ever look at Claire the same way again? Could I ever believe her words? Could I ever trust her? And if I couldn't trust her, did I even want her back? I knew the answer deep down. I didn't want her back, at least not in the way I once did. There was a scar now, a wound that ran deeper than I could comprehend, and no amount of apologies, no amount of "I'm sorries" could take it away. The problem was, I still loved her, and that more than anything was the hardest thing to admit. I turned, not sure where my feet were leading me, but I knew I had to keep moving. The pain in my chest, the hole in my heart, it wasn't going anywhere. It would never go away. Not now. There was no magic fix. But maybe there could be a way forward. I didn't know how, and I didn't know if I even had the strength for it. But I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. So I walked. I wandered for hours, my thoughts like a whirlwind, never settling, always drifting back to her. To Claire. The city was starting to quiet down as I reached the outskirts. the noise of the bars and traffic dimming behind me. I passed quiet, empty streets, the buildings casting long shadows as I walked, and for a moment, it felt like I was the only person alive in this whole vast city. I didn't know how to fix the broken pieces of my heart, but I couldn't keep walking away forever. Maybe someday, I thought, maybe someday I'll figure it out. But for now, the road ahead felt too uncertain, too raw. And so, as the early light of morning began to creep up over the horizon, I found myself in a small park, sitting on a bench, my head in my hands, just needing a moment to breathe. And it was then, in that moment of quiet despair, that the phone rang again. Claire. I didn't even look at it. Instead, I let it ring, its sound sharp against the stillness of the park. I didn't know if I was ready to hear her voice. I stared at the screen, watching her name flash over and over. I can't answer it, I thought. Not yet. For a moment, I thought about blocking her number, cutting her off completely. The urge was there, almost overpowering. But then I stopped myself. What would that really do? I couldn't just pretend she didn't matter. I couldn't pretend I wasn't still trying to figure out who I was without her in my life. But the truth was, I didn't know where to go from here. The road between me and Claire, between me and anything that resembled happiness, felt impossible to see. So I sat there, letting the phone ring one more time, the weight of it pressing down on my chest, and I realized something. This moment, this painful, confusing, uncertain moment, it was mine to face.